Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Suburban Proletarian. Still on vacation, still sporting the scruff here. I want to take a quick look at a watch that most of you will recognize. I've had this a few years now, and it's time to do a battery change. So I figured this would be a good opportunity, since I've got to take the back off anyway, for you to get a look at the movement as I do that. It's been misbehaving for the last couple of weeks. I can't seem to get it to misbehave at the moment, however, when I want to film it. But the end-of-life indicator for the battery has been doing its thing where it jumps forward 5 seconds at a time. And every time I try to film it, it stops doing it and goes back into its normal mode. But as I said, I've had this watch several years. And one thing about Swiss quartz watches, as opposed to Japanese quartz watches, most Japanese watches or Japanese branded watches are using lithium batteries nowadays, and you really shouldn't leave a dead battery in a watch anyway, but lithium batteries are a little bit more forgiving. Swiss watches almost exclusively use these Swiss-made Renata batteries. This one takes the Renata 371. This is a particularly common battery. These Swiss batteries are, I believe, silver oxide, and they have a very, very nasty habit. When they no longer are generating enough electricity to run your watch movement, there is still a bit of a reaction going on inside there. And when it doesn't have a creative outlet, like running a quartz movement, that chemical reaction starts to attack the case of the battery. And these are very, very prone to leakage, not only when they're dead, but also when they're very, very low. So really, it's a good idea, even if your battery's not dead, with these Swiss watches, if the manufacturer tells you that there's like a 5-year battery life, it's probably a good idea to go ahead and just change your battery out at 3 or 4 years rather than waiting the full 5 years or waiting for the thing to die. So let's go ahead and do a battery change on here. That'll give you a chance to take a look at the Ronda movement that's in here. Again, this is the Victorinox I.N.O.X. This has been a very successful series of watches. When they first came out, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, there was a great deal of fanfare. The company famously tested these things by dropping them out of airplanes and running them over with a 10-ton tank or a 20-ton tank or something like that, and boiling them in acid and sandblasting them and freezing them in blocks of ice and doing all kinds of other nasty things. In recent years, and originally there were just 2 models. There was this, and then there was a diver model, which was essentially exactly the same watch, but with a rotating dive bezel on it. This is one of the originals. In more recent years, in response to customer requests, which is always a good thing for companies to do, but it wasn't really a smart move in this case, they have upgraded the watch to a mechanical movement. The quartz movements are still available, but they have added mechanical movements, which is kind of counterproductive to the concept of an indestructible watch. But there are now cases that are made from titanium. There are cases made from carbon fiber. This watch is available on bracelets. It's still available on rubber. They have straps that are made out of braided paracord, and as is normally the case, you know, they'll diversify a product line as much as possible to try to sell as many of them. But this is one of the very first. It's just a plain quartz model on a rubber strap. The standard quartz model is still available on a rubber strap, but the green version has been discontinued. I think it's available on black and red and blue. Each of those comes with a, for instance, a black dial and a black strap, or a red dial and a red strap, blue dial, blue strap. But the green dial, green strap is no longer available. There are still green dial models, but they do not come on a green rubber strap. I don't know why that is. But anyway, let's turn the camera around onto the tabletop. We're going to open this watch up, do a battery change, take a look at the movement, and then I'll give you my thoughts on the watch overall. Okay, everyone, so here is our Victorinox I.N.O.X. And as I already stated, it is failing to cooperate with me. The end-of-life indicator, which has been going on and off intermittently for the last couple of weeks, has for the last 4 or 5 days, while I was on vacation and was waiting to film this video, refused to do its thing. So anyway, we're just going to go ahead and do our battery change anyway. So I've already removed the plastic shroud, this bezel, off of the case, and I've already pre-loosened the case back. So we're just going to turn that off. And the interesting thing about this watch is most Swiss watches, particularly most inexpensive or relatively, these aren't cheap. I mean, I don't know what the MSRP on this watch is now, but I think it's about $500. It's not a cheap watch, but most relatively inexpensive Swiss watches are using case components from places like China, but that's generally marked inside the case back when you open it up. And this watch is not similarly marked. This case back would seem to be made in Switzerland. It has no other markings on it, and it is a very, very, very substantial case back, very heavy. So we'll set that out of the way, and I'll go into my toolkit here, get out my little plastic doohickey, and we've got to remove this nylon spacer, and it's a fairly tight fit, so you want to get in there. I like to use plastic tools when I'm working with something like this. Okay, so we'll get out the plastic forceps here to help us, because this is rather a tight fit. It's not super tight, but it seems like you need 2 tools to get that holder out of there. So we'll put that aside. And that reveals the Swiss quartz movement inside our watch. I believe this is a Ronda. Well, I know it's a Ronda. I believe it's a model 715. It's a fairly common movement. Ronda watches are oftentimes criticized for being kind of cheap in comparison to ETA quartz movements. But in fact, Ronda makes a lot of really robust movements that are made in Switzerland. Well, there's 2 classes of Ronda movements. There are Ronda Swiss movements, like this one, and there are Ronda Swiss parts movements, which are oftentimes branded Harley Ronda. And those are made up of Swiss parts, and then they're assembled in an Asian destination. This is one of the all Swiss made ones. Now there are 2 versions of the 715. The Swiss parts version has a single jewel. And if you Google the Ronda 715, you'll find a lot of people having a lot of problems with Ronda 715s. But if you look carefully and you read the posts carefully, those are almost 100% Ronda 715 Swiss parts, or Harley Ronda 715 Swiss parts movements. This is the all Swiss movement. This one features 5 jewels as opposed to the Harley Ronda Swiss parts 1 jewel. And Ronda movements are kind of utilitarian. You look here, you'll see that some electronic component has been potted in by basically dropping a blob of melted plastic there. They're not pretty, they're not meant to be pretty, but they tend to work very well. And all the ones I've had have been quite accurate. So let's go ahead and do the battery change on this. As you can see here, there's parts of the battery holder that overlap the battery here, and here, and here. And the way to remove these batteries is using a plastic tool. It's very important to remember I'm using a plastic feeler here, and I also have a set of plastic forceps. I've got all kinds of steel forceps as well, but plastic is non-conductive, and you have a much lower chance of shorting out your battery. There's a bit of a trick in changing the battery in one of these ronda movements as opposed to many others. There is a spring-loaded arm right here which catches over the battery. So you need to take a pointed device, preferably a non-conductive plastic one like this, and there's a small hole there, and you simply put your pointed device in the hole, pry the arm out to the side, and the battery will spring out of its holder. Make sure that you take the old battery and dispose of it immediately so that you don't get it mixed up with the new batteries. Get yourself a nice fresh Renata 371. They generally come in these strips. You can just tear them off, and the back of the package simply peels off. And it's best to try not to touch the new battery any more than necessary, just like it's best to try not to touch the inside of the movement as much as possible. And this may take a little bit of finagling, so I'll probably cut away here. Or maybe not. That worked fairly well. Let's see, is our watch running? It is indeed. We've got a nice fresh battery in there. So I'm going to go ahead and close this up, and then we'll take a closer look at the watch itself. So we've got the watch more or less reassembled. Let's get rid of some trash here. And I want to tighten the case back. Now, unless you're trying to loosen a very, very stubborn case back, there's really no good reason to use a giant case back wrench on your case back, because most of these things get over tightened as it is. So I like to use one of these very simple two-prong jobs just to snug the case back up a little bit, just barely more than I could achieve by turning with my two thumbs. And I know this watch has been reviewed over and over and over again over the last few years, and I don't really think there's a whole lot I can add to the equation that would be very, very productive. So let's just take a very quick look at the watch. We get the dimensions out of the way. Now, this is a fairly large watch. The general case diameter is about 43 millimeters. It's just about 53 millimeters over the lugs, and it'll end up standing about, well, it's not too high actually. It stands about 13.6 millimeters off the wrist. But it is a very sizable watch, particularly at 43 millimeters. I know it's not considered a super large watch today, but it sits fairly high off the wrist. It's not terribly obtrusive. The most uncomfortable thing about this watch, or the one thing I would maybe change if I were designing it, is the strap. Oh, and by the way, the lug width is 20 millimeters, so no problem finding aftermarket straps and bracelets. The strap that comes with it is in fact natural rubber, or as it says here, genuine rubber. This also says natural rubber or genuine rubber in French, I believe, and I am not even going to try to pronounce that. But it's actually quite stiff. It's very tough, but it's quite stiff. It's not particularly soft and flexible and comfortable, and it is about as thick as a flat iron steak, and as I've already stated, twice as tough. But it definitely gives you a feeling of ruggedness. I don't think there's much that you could throw at this strap that would cause it to fail. The case is just massive. Victorinox made a big deal about this when the watch first came out a few years ago. I mean, look at the crown guards that are integral to the case, that wrap around the crown, which is nicely signed. It's got the Victorinox logo on there. Just massive. The lugs for the strap are massive. And then they added this bit of webbing in here to make them even stronger. I mean, this thing just feels like it was hewn out of a piece of granite. And mine's not perfectly new anymore, as you can see. It's pretty scratched up. I mostly wear this watch if I go camping or engage in outdoor activities. And the bezel ring has gotten scratched up a little bit. I think there's been a lot of people that have complained that the steel is too soft, that it scratches too easily. I don't think it has anything to do with the steel alloy. As far as I know, this is 316L, just like a lot of other high-end watches. It's just that these very highly polished surfaces here, most of the case is brushed, but you've got these polished, highly polished flats here. They're in prominent places that are going to rub against things, and they're going to get scratched. Now, mine isn't too badly scratched because Victorinox actually shipped the watch with one of these protectors that goes over the outside. This is molded out of nylon. And boy, you talk about some wrist presence. When you've got this thing on here, it really stands up off the wrist. By adding that on, you now increase the case diameter for all intents and purposes to 51 millimeters. And now the thing is standing off the wrist almost 16 millimeters. So that does add some bulk, but it's nice because it does really protect the watch in just about every direction. The watch does feature a sapphire crystal. Mine has yet to get scratched at all. It is slightly recessed below the stainless steel bezel ring, but it's definitely really protected with the nylon guard on there. It makes the sapphire crystal sit pretty low down in there. I don't know that that's really necessary. It would be if this was a mineral crystal, but well, I guess sapphire is a mineral, but if it was a hardened mineral glass crystal, it would be. Now, all of the indices on the dial and the Victorinox logo, they all stand up very proud of the dial. There's a lot of three-dimensionality going on here between the chapter ring and the indices and the logo. They look for all the world as though they were applied, but Victorinox made a very distinct point in their promotional materials when they first introduced the watch to point out that the indices are in fact not applied. The dial is stamped out of a solid piece of metal, and all of the markers are actually stamped up out of the dial. So there's no chance of one of them coming loose and falling off. So I guess I don't really have a whole lot else to say about the Victorinox I.N.O.X. It's been around for a few years. It's certainly been covered many times here and elsewhere online. People have subjected these things to enormous pressure and enormous abuse, and they really hold up. And for me, this is just about my favorite really, really rugged duty watch. So I guess I don't have a lot else to say. Let's go ahead and wrap this up. So when it comes to indestructible watches, there's really three brands out there. There's the Casio G-Shock, there's the Victorinox, of which I am not a particularly big fan. I know they're very popular rugged duty watches, but every single one I've come in contact with has developed problems. And then, of course, there's Victorinox. And of all of Victorinox's watches, the I.N.O.X series is the one which is designed to be the most indestructible, the most bomb-proof. Again, they did all this massive testing on the watch with all sorts of radiation and everything else you could possibly imagine. And the watch generally pulled through. I think the promotional literature they put out when the watch was first released a few years ago said that they had destroyed quite a few watches in the process. But the final product turned out to be really, really good. One of my favorite watches. And if I ever came down to the point where I was going to kind of weed out, well, actually I do need to weed out my collection. I'm going to be getting rid of a bunch of watches pretty soon because there's just too many of them around. Even if I got rid of all of my Casio G-Shocks, which is not particularly likely, but if it did happen, this is the rugged duty watch that would be the last to go. From my standpoint, it is a bit big. It's not the most comfortable watch in the world, but it's the most indestructible bomb-proof watch I've ever seen in my life, and I'm definitely going to hold on to this one. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider subscribing. It goes a long way to help keep me here on the tube. If you're already a subscriber and you haven't already done so, click the little bell icon down below. That will allow YouTube to send you notifications when I post new content to the channel. Like, share, tell your friends, all those things are great. And when I do post my next video, I hope to see each of you here then. Later, guys. I hope to see each of you here then.
Well, you just hip.